Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. I'm just going to go over some of the GoToWebinar menu items for you. So at any time during the presentation, feel free to type in a question in the question area. We're going to take questions at the end. I've also have the handout in the handout section, and this will be recorded, so you get a recording a few days later. But with that, I will start. And first off, thanks for joining us for our presentation today with Hard to Reach or Hardly Reached, using community-based research strategies to improve HIV prevention outcomes among Black and Latinx women. And I'll be introducing our presenter in 2 seconds. So I'm Stacy Penn. I'm the NVivo Community Director here at QSR, and I've been lucky enough to be working with my colleague Allie from SAGE on this series. So I just wanted Allie to introduce herself.
Hi, everyone. I hope you're having a good end to your week, and thanks, Stacy, for the introduction. I am the commissioning editor at SAGE Publishing in London, and I work on research methods books all across the social sciences. Really excited to be here today.
Great, thank you. So I want to introduce our speaker, Liesl Neidiger, and she's an assistant professor in health behavior and health education, and the director of the Gender Health Equity Lab at the University of Texas at Austin. She's earned her PhD in health promotion sciences with a concentration in global health, and her master's in public health from Claremont Graduate University School of Community and Global Health. So with that, I'd like to say hi to Liesl, and I am going to make our presenter now.
All right.
Excellent. We can see you and your PowerPoint.
Okay, wonderful. Well, thank you so much for having me today. It's a pleasure to be here, and thank you for everybody who's attending on this Friday. So just a little bit about myself to give you a context of where I'm coming from. So most of my research is in sexual health or HIV prevention, particularly among women who experience trauma. And so I conducted one study in Milwaukee where I was looking at pre-exposure prophylaxis, or PrEP, which is the once daily HIV prevention pill that's been out. Now we have Descovy and Truvada. At the time, Truvada was the only option. And I was looking to see if women were interested, had heard about it, were interested, and would potentially adopt PrEP. And so I conducted a qualitative longitudinal study. I interviewed women 4 times over 6 months. And then I moved to Austin, where I'm at now at UT. And I conducted a similar study with Black and Latinx mothers. And I was interested in seeing any differences between Milwaukee, particularly because PrEP is actually advertised in Austin, and it was not in Milwaukee. And also just seeing the contextual differences between, Texas is very different than Wisconsin. And so I did a similar study. It was a little bit shorter, and I looked at, I interviewed women 3 times over 3 months. And part of the interview was asking about potential interventions. And so today I'm going to be going over just kind of the definition of hard to reach communities and barriers when accessing communities. I'm also going to talk about some difficulties in health research, and then, where we can go from here. What are some tips that I've learned? And so I'm going to kind of take you through some of the process that I've been through that has been formative and really, really helpful, and what were some of the maybe missteps that I did and how we overcame that. So first of all, traditionally hard to reach populations are defined as populations that are difficult for researchers to access and recruit for studies. The problem I see with this is that it really puts the onus on the community and on the potential participants rather than on the researchers. And so you'll see throughout the presentation, I have hard to reach in quotes because are they really actually hard to reach? And I found this definition from 1990 that defines hard to reach populations as those who are disadvantaged and disenfranchised, the homeless and transient, chronically mentally ill, high school dropouts, criminal offenders, prostitutes, juvenile delinquents, gang members, runaways, and other street people. And normally at this point, I would ask for feedback on and reactions to that. But one of the things that I noticed with this definition is that it really defines people by characteristics. And, you know, it's a person experiencing homelessness or a person experiencing severe or chronic mental health symptoms. And so we need to really be careful about the language that we use when we're working with these so-called hard to reach communities. So what are some of the barriers that we see when working with certain communities? Well, mistrust for sure. There's a ton of history of mistreatment of different communities, especially BIPOC communities, but LGBTQIA, individuals experiencing homelessness, all sorts of different communities. And so that mistrust will lead people to be a little bit more hesitant to actually engage in research. Fear of authority. There's also could be the perception of no personal or community benefit, and that research could actually potentially harm or stigmatize or mistreat or even exploit different communities. There could be a fear of exposure of illicit behaviors such as illicit substance use or gambling, or a fear of exposure if somebody identifies with a socially stigmatized group, such as an individual who is HIV positive. Also, cultural beliefs of not wanting to engage, lack of awareness of research or education about participation in research, including the process or the significance of the research, why is it being done. Gatekeepers, so we'll talk about the importance of working with the community, and if a gatekeeper is not on board, they could deter other individuals from wanting to participate. And sometimes we have extremely strict eligibility criteria, and so there's obviously, for methodological reasons, we want to have strict eligibility criteria, but we need to be a little bit careful, because if it's too strict, then we're going to be excluding potentially really important individuals. So I'm briefly going to go over community-based research, or CBR, so not CBPR, but it's a CBR. And this takes place in community settings and involves community members in the design and implementation of research projects. This demonstrates respect for the contributors of the success that is made by these community partners, and really respects the principle of, you know, doing no harm, which we see a lot in, you know, which is a concern in medical research and for the communities involved. So in order to achieve this, the principles should guide the development of research projects involving collaboration between researchers and community partners. And this could be formal community partners like a CBO, or it could be an informal group, like maybe a support group, or just individual community members. So CBR is a collaborative enterprise between the researchers, so this could be professors or faculty or students, and community members, and it engages university faculty, staff, students with diverse partners and community members. It validates multiple sources of knowledge and promotes the use of multiple methods of discovery and of the dissemination or knowledge that is produced from the research. And often what we see is, at least especially in the beginning stages, is that CBR is often qualitative. So I'm going to take you through some steps that I went through with some of the studies and focusing mainly on recruitment here. And so with the first study I described that took place in Milwaukee, where I interviewed women 4 times over 6 months about PrEP, we were also diving into a lot of other things. I'm really interested in the kind of the intersection between trauma and HIV risk, structural factors. And so the in-depth interview was extremely in-depth and covered a lot of different things. And I was speaking with our graphic designer because I wanted some sort of logo and I wanted a study name. And we're going on and he's, you know, I'm describing the study and I'm like, there's just a ton of layers. He's like, what about layers? And I was like, that's perfect, because I was really trying to shy away from having research or study in the title because of mistrust and everything and perceptions. And so I thought that was great. And so I asked him to come up with a kind of logo and help me with flyers. And he came up with this. Not my favorite, and but I'm not a graphic artist. I don't know. I can tell you if something looks good or not, but I can't tell you how to fix it. And so I was like, oh, okay, we'll go with this. And so this is an example of a palm card. So it was about a little bigger than a business card that we would hand out to participants. And I was really lucky in Milwaukee because one of our research assistants was a former gang member and then was in schools mentoring girls to ensure that they stay in school and don't join gangs. And she was also a minister in a local church serving lower SES communities. And so she offered to help link me to participants and kind of vouch for me. And so she is one of the gatekeepers that was absolutely essential in this research. And so their church was doing like a rummage sale or something. It wasn't exactly a sale, it was free for women in the area, but they could come and get things for their house or clothes for their children or themselves or their partners. And so Barb, our staff member, research staff, she let me set up a table, and she would send women over to me for me to tell them about the study and sign up. And I actually signed up about a third of participants from that event alone. And then from there, they would just share either the card or just tell their friends or family about it, because they're like, you get to talk to this woman about your life for an hour or so and you get paid for it. So how cool is that? And so I actually had no problem recruiting. It was basically, social network and, snowball sampling. And it went really, really well. I actually had to finally start turning people away from the study. So that was great. So then when I moved to Austin, I wanted to do, like I said, something similar. And we kept with the layers name because it was still, somewhat of a similar study. And I was having a lot of difficulty recruiting with this flyer, not surprisingly. And so one of my colleagues connected me with a community partner with these two women who are community health workers. We went out to lunch, and so I was talking to them about the study and difficulties and things that we've done already. And then I showed them the flyer, and they literally started laughing. And so I took notes vigorously on, different things that they were saying and how to improve it. And at the time, one of my students in my lab, she was taking a graphic design course. And so she took their feedback and then developed this flyer. So I'm sure you all agree that this is definitely better than the first one. But it's still not great. This worked well enough for us to reach saturation with our study, but we definitely have a difficult time recruiting. And there's a number of reasons for this. It's not just because of the flyers. There is the mistrust, and we're dealing with a lot of gentrification here and segregation in Austin. So there's a lot of factors here on top of this. So like I said at the beginning, the final interview, we asked the participants to tell us what would be a good intervention to get women like you on PrEP. And so from that, we designed a couple different studies. One's already under review with NIH, the other one will be submitted soon. And what we did was we designed a formative study where we actually went through every part of the interventions that we had developed and ran them by participants. And it was everything from number of sessions, session content, the length of the sessions, who should be the facilitator of these different programs, the study name. We got feedback on the flyers. And so what the women said was they want, if we're having conversations, the flyer should should demonstrate that. So another student in my lab is an advertising major, and so she put this together based on feedback. And so once we had this, then part of our formative study, we were able to say, okay, so this is the flyer in which you were recruited with, what can we change? And what came out was that, you know, my student was just trying to have their clothing different, but it looks like the woman on the right is a doctor because she's wearing a white coat. And that can kind of show that there's maybe a power imbalance or something like that, where we really just want conversation. And so we showed this to probably about 3 or 4 participants and gathered all of their feedback together. And my student put together this. And we've been getting really, really good feedback. We've now run it by, I think, 5, 6, or 7 different participants, and so this has been really great. And so my point of going through all of this is how important it is to work with the community, because this is a far cry from the original one that I had been using. So I'm going to shift gears quickly. So because I do work in sexual health, we have to be really careful about language, and language regarding sexual health often implies implicitly like victim blaming. Sexual health and HIV frequently, HIV prevention, actually, excuse me, frequently point to protecting oneself from unfaithful partners or promoting condom use in monogamous relationships. It may not take into account what the circumstances and the context is. What if a woman is in an abusive relationship? What if she's engaging in survival sex? And, you know, so focusing on the behavior is not always conducive to what we're trying to get, and we might be missing a lot of information here. And only focusing on behavioral, you know, is not always going to get us the results that we're looking for. So I have some examples of quotes of different situations, contextual situations in which participants were in, where, you know, our traditional way of focusing on sexual health and HIV prevention might not be very helpful. So one participant, this is in Milwaukee, she said, I really didn't want to do it. It was just business to me. We were coworkers, but he would always proposition me, and he knew I had a guy. I really didn't want to, but it was like boyfriend didn't get paid till this day, and I didn't get paid till this day. And to give you a little bit of background, she was actually a manager at a fast food chain, and so she was working full time and still could not pay her bills, and engaged in survival sex. This participant previously, when she was younger, so she was 47 at the time of this interview, so about 20 years prior, she was experiencing homelessness. She was frequently using crack cocaine, and she was engaging in sex exchange. And so she has since recovered from using crack cocaine, is no longer homeless. And so she was talking to a friend one day, and she said, I was just talking to him about my struggles and all of that. I didn't go over there with the intent to have sex for money. We wound up drinking and having sex, and he gave me money to get food. It's like I'm still a prostitute. And so this was really hard for her, and really difficult, because it kind of brought her back to a place that she didn't want to be, and she had been away from for quite some time. So with this participant, this one was in Austin, I asked if she had ever had sex in exchange for either money or shelter or, you know, goods of any type, and she responded, yeah, to get some stuff for my kids, milk, food, money to provide for my kids. And then she actually talked about a situation when she was younger and experiencing homelessness. She said, I actually been homeless since I've been 16, just staying with different people. I was the only girl there. He practically took care of me, but then he didn't. And then this is the last one from another participant in Milwaukee who would, or in Austin, who would smoke marijuana frequently. She said the significant, and she was responding to the same question as the previous participant. She said the significant other does provide me with marijuana, and there's times, not that I specifically have sex for money, but it just seems like you can't say no. So now I want to bring your attention to these pie charts of our US population of women and then HIV diagnoses. And so on the right side, you can see white women, non-Hispanic white women make up almost 2/3 of the population, followed by Latina and then Black. But then if we look at HIV diagnoses, over half of them are among Black African American women, then among non-Hispanic white women, and then among Latina. And if we're looking at Texas specifically, Black African American women contract HIV at rates almost 4 times that of non-Hispanic white women, and 17.5 times in Austin. And so it's really, really, this is a severe disparity in Austin. And I will, spoiler alert, I will tell you that that we're not finding significant differences between individual risk behaviors between Black African American women and non-Hispanic white. So there's something else that's going on here. And I'm only going to touch on a few because there's a lot of different things, but they tend to be more structural. So we're seeing housing instability or substandard housing, medical mistrust, or just lack of access to healthcare, especially when we're dealing with the gentrification. There's oftentimes not clinics and locations where we need to have them. Public transportation sucks, to be frank, and especially during COVID, even though we're not supposed to be seeing people getting, kicked out of their housing, we're seeing a lot of homelessness. Unemployment is just through the roof right now, among a bunch of different populations. And when I asked one of the participants about how can we improve HIV PrEP access for women, or what are some barriers and everything, and she said a barrier to her not being able to get on PrEP was not being white. And that was because since she's Black, she had trouble getting a job. That meant she didn't have insurance and has no money. And so she basically said, if I was white, I'd be able to get on PrEP. And she did try to go to the clinic, but she was turned away because she didn't have insurance. And so here it's really important to work with our community partners. These are just a few examples of community partners that I've been working with on some of my research. And some of them are just, they hand out the flyers or have the flyers on the table for us, and that's great. Others actually help with prescribing PrEP. Others are going to help with facilitation for different interventions and programs. But the point here is that they all do something different, and they all are so incredibly valuable. And, with the networking of, reaching out just and meeting other individuals from different communities or community organizations. And this way, not everybody has to do one thing. And so at the end of our each interview, we would give a resource guide. And if, there was food insecurity, then we had a list of food pantries and different things. If there was unemployment problems, then we had a list of organizations that help with resume writing and finding a job. That doesn't mean we have to find all of that, but that's why it's important to connect with the community, not only to help with recruitment and participation, but it's important to know what resources are out there and really, really work together to end something like HIV that has been going on for a very long time now. So I'm just going to go over some different things that we can think about of ways to increase participation in our research among these hard to reach communities. So one is just using non-probability sampling. So I provided an example already of the snowball social network type of recruitment, and that worked extraordinarily well, especially if you develop a really good rapport with the participants. It can be extremely beneficial to have people vouch for you. Venue sampling, that's not quite as, we don't do that quite as much anymore, but it can work depending on where it is. Using community organizations, and if they're accepting of the research and they think it's a great idea, they can just, when somebody signs in, hey, just check this out, this might be applicable to you. Social media, and so we'll be working with this grant that, fingers crossed that it's going to get funded. It's looking good so far, but we're actually going to be hiring a company that specifically does social media marketing, and we can have them tailor the ads specifically to different people on Instagram and Facebook. And so working that, and that was actually a recommendation of several of our participants, was using social media, using different groups, and we were trying to get names of different groups that we can work with on Facebook. Include gatekeepers. And so this means you could even pay them to help with recruitment, or you can have a community advisory board with members from the priority population and the gatekeepers. As in my example previously, Barb was extraordinarily helpful, and she was a really important, respected gatekeeper, and I give her the credit as to why the study took off the way that it did. The study language, so again, I tried to really avoid using like research or study, but you also want to make sure, especially depending on whatever population it is, really using inclusive language and definitely appropriate literacy levels. And then whenever you come up with these ideas, it's really important for us to pilot them. And so we got a bunch of feedback from everybody, and now we're going into the R34 stage of piloting this, and we're going to get even more feedback, and we're going to make some more tweaks before going into the R01 phase. As far as retention, obviously, most of us being researchers are going to be having some sort of incentives or maybe vouchers, could be bus passes, it could be gift cards to a grocery store. I tend to use Tango just so people can choose whatever gift card they actually want. Different forms of tracking and reminders and checking in with people. I would ask people for the phone number and email address, and then ask them their preferred method of contact, and then would keep in touch with them every 2 weeks and just send them a text, just, hey, how are you? Just checking in, and part of that was to gauge if people were adopting PrEP, so I could start tracking that. But the other reason was for retention. And especially in Milwaukee, we had 30 participants and only one did not complete her 4th interview. Everybody else completed all 4 interviews. And so we had great retention there. Also telling people why they are participating in those research. A lot of times, especially with qualitative work, we're not going to see, the participants are not going to see direct benefits to themselves. But if they know that we're actually listening and taking in the information that they're giving us, and that they're helping develop something to improve the community health, then that's something that a lot of people get really excited about. And it's also really important to build relationships and trust and a good rapport with individuals. Obviously, there's a fine line between going overboard, but just things like, oh, my child is sick, can I reschedule? And, just being really flexible with that kind of stuff. Yes, it can be frustrating and everything, but it really shows that you care, and that you're showing that you're having a caring environment, and that both what you're presenting to them and also whatever environment you're interviewing them with, if it's not in their own home. I do about half and half. And then the providing some sort of method for the participants to be in contact with us. And so we would get a Google Voice number, and that way participants could call or text or email our study email address. And so if they had any questions or anything coming up, or sometimes they would say, hey, the next interview, I now have to work, can we reschedule that, before we even reached out to them. And then just as a recap here, it's just so important to use non-judgmental language. It's really careful. You have to be so careful when, for example, asking about sex exchange. And there's a difference between survival sex and sex exchange, and making sure the question is worded appropriately. So it's not going to, people are going to be, talking about sex, people are going to probably, close off a little bit, but depending on how it's worded, they might be more inclined to answer it truthfully. Same thing with, substance use or number of sex partners, and just making sure everything is worded in a non-judgmental way. And who can help with that but the population themselves? You can run these things by them, and so that's the process that we're in right now, is running a lot of this stuff by participants. obviously formative research, and then the next stage is piloting it and constantly getting the feedback loop with your community. I know a lot of us will just include community advisory boards because that's kind of the buzzword and everybody's doing it and NIH likes to see it, but really use them. I was actually a part of a community advisory board, which I shouldn't have been because I wasn't a member of the community, and it was 80% of UT faculty, staff, and researchers. And I'm like, that's not a CAB. That's a faculty and research group that has a couple community members. And so really having a CAB that is made up of gatekeepers and key people from the community and from the priority population or people affected by whatever you're looking at. And so that's where kind of gathering names for our for the study coming up to actually formulate that. And then just really not looking at things as behavioral, but that there's other things that are affecting risk and health. And we can't just always say, well, pick yourself up by your bootstraps and just use a condom. It's not that simple, and really kind of seeing the bigger picture. And I like to think of it as like a funnel. And if people are unable to put food on the table, they can't get a job, they don't have access to health care. Well, if we're talking about their sexual health, it's really low on their priority list when they have all of these other things going on. And so really taking that into account and making some sort of combination of a study that includes structural and not. So I didn't, hopefully I went over everything that I said. I want to leave you with a final thought, and then I'd love to get some questions. I'm more of an interactive type of speaker, so I'd rather engage more and hear some of your questions. But I like to leave everybody with one of the most powerful quotes that one of the participants said from the study in Austin. And she said, "Oh, to be a Black woman, not to be a statistic, not to just succumb to whatever they think you are because you're a Black woman. The loud, obnoxious, got 7 or 8 different baby daddies on welfare. It's about strength. I feel like we're more empowered. I feel like I'm the shit as a Black woman because I've overcome a lot of stereotypes and statistics on both sides of being Black and a woman." And with that, I'd like to thank you all for your time, and I'll take some questions.
Great. Thank you so much, Elisa. That was a great presentation. While people are, and I just want to let people know, you can type in your questions in the question area, and there's also the handout. I'm just going to make myself presenter first. Let me do that. And while people are doing the questions, I'm going to just go over a few things with people, some announcements. So just remind you of all the different stuff that the NVivo community is doing with the webinar series, the podcast. I'm going to talk a little bit about the virtual conference in a second, and also check out our redesigned NVivo community forum too. And here are the more upcoming webinars in the next couple of weeks, so feel free to join those. And the virtual conference, so we're excited to announce this. It'll be in September, but you can submit abstracts now until June 30th. So all these links are in the handout, so it's easy for you to get to the right sites. And lastly, we're excited because we're going to have an early career researcher grant that's going to be announced soon, but my coworker Silvana Di Gregorio needs reviewers for the grant. So if you're interested, please go to that link and sign up. So we appreciate any help you can give us with that. So there's a question here I had where I always find this interesting. I guess maybe because I've been talking to more researchers with the work I'm doing as a community director, and I've noticed more and more researchers are using graphic designers to help them. Is that common, do you find, or is it just depends on the researcher?
I think it depends on the researcher, but I will say where I was before, the graphic designer was used more for making like poster presentations or making slides look good for presentations, helping prepare for conferences. And they didn't really use him as much for things on the study.
Right.
So that was, I was kind of surprised that he wasn't used more than he was, but what I'm noticing, and I think this is kind of the direction of the field, is that we're seeing a lot of people in like health communication or in advertising or social media experts who are really interested in health-related research. And so I have a really diverse lab with majors from, you know, government to advertising to communication. And so I think we're going to see a shift where it's going to start being used a lot more, especially too, because we're going to be moving online. You know, like COVID is not going away. Like we're still going to be doing a lot of studies virtually, not 100% once everything is you know, back to normal. But I think because of the shift online, we're also going to see a little bit more of that.
Yeah, because one researcher I was working with, she uses a graphic designer for infographics about the study, the results of the study to share with people, and I thought that was really cool. So
I love that. Yeah, we actually, my former graduate research assistant, now project manager, she took as a class specifically learning how to develop infographics, and so she helped that with our presentations and everything. It's a great skill to have.
So here's a question from Anna. So thank you for your presentation. When you're talking about community-based research, does it imply that communities also do the research and analyze the results? Could you please talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, so what I like to do is actually analyze the results with them. And so sometimes somebody is going to take a different perspective on what the results mean or the implications of it. So I wouldn't necessarily say that they are doing the analyzing, but I think keeping part of the community with every step that you're doing and making sure, you know, like doing participant checks and making sure that people can review the results or even what you're interpreting out of their interview is really important. And so whether it's the evaluation or the analysis or the implications of results, I would say it's really important to use the community. And that's why also a community advisory board would be really helpful to go with that, because they might pick up on something that there's no way I would have seen and noticed.
Great, thank you.
And sorry, Stacy, I was going to say I have another question from Caroline. When conducting interviews with a racially diverse group, do you acknowledge your own identity and privilege in the process?
That's a great question. And yes, absolutely. And sometimes it can be a hindrance and sometimes it's not. Most of the participants in Milwaukee, because the Black community and African American community is really small in Milwaukee. And so I was told by several participants that they actually appreciated that I was outside of their community because it felt more confidential to them. But we definitely start things off that way, and me acknowledging that. And we also try to we try to have people sit in on the interview, like an observer who is different than I am. And so that way we're hoping that they'll build a rapport with at least one of us. But yes, absolutely. And that I'm glad that was brought up, because that's, especially working with the community, that is a really essential thing to acknowledge right away. So you're not creating this power dynamic or turning people off.
Here's a question from Victoria. How do you go about relationship building with gatekeepers? How do you make initial connections and then grow the relationship?
Yeah, that's a great question. If there's some sort of community group where there's a lot of people that are interested in the same thing and joining that, I'm personally a part of Fast Track Cities, which is an HIV, end HIV epidemic initiative that's actually worldwide. And I've met a ton of my community partners who either connect me with gatekeepers or maybe the gatekeepers themselves. So I would recommend, if there is some sort of kind of organization that you can kind of help, where you're going to get people from a bunch of different, there's researchers on there, there's community organizations, there are just individuals interested in ending the HIV epidemic on there. So that has been extraordinarily helpful. Also working with churches. And so reaching out to, a church leader and kind of explain what you want to do and how you want to work with the community. I haven't personally done that other than with Barb, who's already on our staff, but I have another colleague who specifically does HIV research among the African American community and works solely with churches. And she's been able to build that rapport. And I've heard of a bunch of people doing that. So that's another way of kind of getting your foot in the door with the community, because even if the church isn't your main source of recruitment or anything, chances are the gatekeepers are going there. And so that's another possibility.
Great. And I have another one from Natalie. Thank you so much for this presentation. Are there instances where community organization staff have been present for data collection or interviews, given the relationship or trust they already have built with the participants?
That's a good question. We have not. I think it would depend on the situation, and as long as if the participant prefers that, I would say, go for it. I work with a lot of women who are in shelters and have caseworkers and case managers, and I know there was a fear of some of the stuff that they were talking about that they wouldn't want their case manager to know about. And nothing was extraordinarily bad, but things that, they just didn't want to share. So I think it just depends on the situation. And what I always say is, we're going to interview you. It needs to be in a location where, one, we have privacy, and two, you're okay with whoever is around, and you feel safe. And so sometimes that would be at an interview room in my office. Sometimes it's at their home. Sometimes it's at the park. But I think that's a really important point that I think you would just ask ahead of time and make accommodations, whatever makes them feel most comfortable. There was, this isn't totally in line with the question, but just kind of going back to just going with whatever the participants feel comfortable with. In Milwaukee, there was a study going on. I wasn't a part of it, but they were doing focus groups among Black MSM, men who have sex with men. And one of our research staff, is Black MSM, from the community. And some participants really liked that he was facilitating the focus group because they knew him. They felt like he really understood them because he was part of the community. And then others, because it was such a small community, they were like, I'm going to see him at a bar. Like, I don't want to be telling him my deep, dark secrets. And so they got a completely different facilitator for those. And so they literally just gave them the option, and they would schedule that way. And so I think that's, just whatever's going to make people the most comfortable.
Great, thank you. And here's one more question. So from Caroline, thank you for the presentation. When discussing sensitive topics like sexual health, how do you balance empathy and emotions with scientific neutrality? I imagine it may feel like a therapy session at times.
It can, and especially doing qualitative work, you have to be careful on, sometimes I'll correct some things if they're like, well, you can get HIV from mosquitoes. Well, no, you can't. And so I'll correct some things, but there's other things where, like I've had an interview with somebody who was, she was against PrEP because she was like an anti-vaxxer, anti-government engaging in anything. Her mother was even HIV positive, and she was against like ARVs and all of that. And so you kind of have to balance that with what's appropriate at the time. Like, this is not an intervention. I'm not here to educate you. I'm here to listen. And so that can be really hard. But it's also hard when they're disclosing trauma, because you do kind of get caught up in that, and there's often tears, and so kind of making sure that you are showing that empathy, but like you said, remaining neutral. And so one thing is, I will try to show my empathy more with body language, and just kind of leaning forward, or I never like touch the participant. I don't give them a hug or put my hand on their shoulder or anything, but I lean in so they know that I'm really listening to them. I'll ask if they need to take a break. I'll provide tissues if they're crying, and sometimes we do take a break, or we'll say, why don't we come back to this if you're comfortable, and let's move on right now. So I do it more with body language, I guess, than I do verbally. And I just kind of wait for their cues on what they're comfortable with. So it's hard. And I mean, there was one day, and I would never recommend doing more than 1 or 2 interviews in one day. One day I did 3, and they were all, there was a lot of trauma in all 3 of them, and it was just exhausting mentally for me, and obviously the participants. It was, you know, way worse because they're the ones experiencing it. But I think I almost like kind of became almost a zombie by the end, because it was so much to take in when I wasn't doing as well of a job as I should have been. And so just kind of remaining neutral, but nodding and showing that you care by your body language, I'd say is the best. But that's my best answer.
Well, thank you. That was great questions we had, and the presentation was really informative, and I think very helpful. So I want to thank you for presenting today, Liesel, and just want to remind people, actually, we also did a podcast together, so that's on too. So, you know, it's a little bit different discussion. So if people are interested, they can check that out. But I just want to thank you for your time and everyone for being here.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me, and thank you everybody for attending.
Thank you, Stacy. Thank you, Lisa. And thank you, everybody. I hope you all have a good weekend.
Thanks.
Yes, it's Friday. Yay. Bye, bye everyone.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.